thank you for coming. This session is titled Library Collections and Academic Publications as Artificial Intelligence Training Data. So if that's not what you want to hear about, leave. But I appreciate you coming at the end of the day. I thought they were joking before, but you really can't see anybody from up here. So I trust that there are people in the crowd. So I'm going to do some brief introductions here, and how this is going to work is we're just going to really just have a panel discussion with some fantastic panelists. So I am Dave Hansen, Executive Director of the Authors Alliance, and if you haven't heard of the Authors Alliance before, we are a nonprofit that exists to support authors who want to see their works widely disseminated and who support access to knowledge. So I'm just going to go down the table here and do some very, very brief introductions. So first we have Dan Cohen, who is Dean of the Libraries at Northeastern University. Next we have Gunter Weibel, who is the Associate Vice Provost and Executive Director of the California Digital Library. Next we have Suzanne Wones, who is the University Librarian at the University of California, Berkeley. Next, we have Claire Stewart, who is Dean of the Libraries at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And then right at the end, Mike Furlow, Executive Director of HathiTrust. So my job is really easy because I just ask questions and then they have to answer all of these really hard questions. And we're going to try to leave ample time for audience participation. So be thinking of what you would like to ask these folks. And just as a little premise or background for what we're talking about today, really this session is about what principles should guide libraries as they consider allowing or limiting access to their collections for AI training. And I think this is very, very timely. In my interactions with librarians over the last year or 2 years, really, there is clearly increasing interest in library collections as fodder for AI training and for text data mining and for other computational research applications. And so I will give a shout out to a project actually that Dan and I are working on together, and he'll probably say more about this. Through Authors Alliance, we were very fortunate to announce a grant from the Mellon Foundation just last week, focusing on this subject. So it's about developing a public interest training corpus of books. And the idea with this grant, and I think some of the ideas that we hope to bring out in this discussion are what are those academic research, public interest principles and characteristics that we really want to prioritize when we think about library collections being used for AI training. So with that, I'll just jump into my questions. Dan, I'm going to start with you. One of the premises of this session is that library collections are valuable for AI training. Could you talk a little bit about why that is so, and why should libraries and universities care?
Great. Thanks a lot, Dave, and I'm delighted to be working with you on this project. So, this might be an odd audience to remind of the value of library collections. I feel a little bit awkward doing that, but I'm going to do it anyway. Maybe just briefly with a brief anecdote. This year is the 50th anniversary of the publication of Robert Caro's book on Robert Moses in New York, The Power Broker. And I think if you've followed, this is one of the greatest works of nonfiction. And if you've followed the coverage, a lot of it is on reassessing his analysis of Robert Moses in New York. And the other half of the coverage has just been a kind of awe at what human intelligence can do when applied to a real research ethic and collections and a decade of work in processing all of those and distilling them down into a book. And so I think it's worth sort of reminding ourselves that on the shelves of our libraries are many books, maybe not as good as The Power Broker is, but many works that are in effect a extremely high quality gold standard distillation of incredible amounts of documents and research. They're sort of their own LLMs processed through one person's brain, and that there's just so much intelligence built into what we have on our shelves. And so, if you think about books as the original kind of structured data and again, a kind of distillation of other information, then I think we can move from that to easily saying, why wouldn't we want to match that up with some of the, the newer technologies that we have? And, when Dave and I wrote about adding books into this world of AI, we know that there are some books that have been slurped up by the big AI vendors, but within the distilled math of OpenAI's service or Anthropic's service, Caro's work on multi-volume work on LBJ is sitting there right next to, at AwesomeBro37 on Twitter's statements about LBJ being, a lame lib dem. And so if you want to call me elitist, I would say that we can gain value, I think, by upping the high quality content and maybe lowering the Reddit threads and the tweets about these things. So we're in a strange point where there's been incredible advances in AI, but a kind of strange training set that's been used. And we don't really know yet what the best of both worlds looks like, where you have high quality training corpus that would have books and, the best and in the latest technology. And this is true for non-book items as well. And I know we'll get to that as well. But again, on our shelves are rich and diverse sets of materials that have been vetted and that have metadata associated with them. And we really haven't fully explored yet or started to explore what might happen when AI is applied to them. I think it's also worth pausing at this moment and saying, what can AI do that's not just about autocomplete on steroids and what we're seeing out of the generative AI models. And we've already seen some of that today, for instance, with what Yale was doing on their special collections. There's so many other parts of the research life cycle that it's just the tip of the iceberg. We have not explored how students and faculty and independent researchers can apply AI on top of these high quality materials to scan through them for things that they might want to read in a more traditional way, not auto summarization. We haven't explored how we can create new forms of metadata for our libraries, create better search tools. There's just a lot more that can be done around AI and library collections that really is just adjacent to, but beyond, I think, what we're seeing out there in the commercial landscape. And so I think combining our great collections with some really thoughtful applications of technology is a great start to something new.
Thanks, Dan. All right, so Mike, I am going to move to you. I had to ask Mike if this was an okay question. Mike, HathiTrust has 18 million already digitized volumes, and many are not widely available elsewhere. So in my mind, this makes HathiTrust a very high value data set for AI training, but clearly you have not just opened the floodgates just yet. So could you talk about some of the logistical, ethical, contractual, legal issues that make this complicated?
If you give me the rest of the hour. Also, I should say, if you're here because I owe you an email, please wait till after the session to talk to me about that. Let's see. So I think one thing I would start with is that we've had at HathiTrust a long commitment to making the collection available for research uses by individuals, but also by machines and human-assisted machines. And we think that's our responsibility to do so. We've recommitted to that in this past year. We have for a long time operated the HathiTrust Research Center. Recently, we've talked about how we can make the corpus available or use the corpus and engage with machine learning or artificial intelligence or what have you to make better uses of the collection and improve quality of services, quality of the corpus, quality of metadata, et cetera. Some of the things that Dan was just talking about. It's easy to say that we want to do that in the abstract. It's a lot harder to say, what actually are the problem sets, that we really think we could solve through that, and finding the ways of defining that. So we've been giving that a fair amount of thought. And I think I should say here up front, we don't, just to be clear, as Dave was acknowledging here, we do not have any existing arrangements, commercial or non-commercial, with any party to make the corpus available for large model training right now. And I can talk a little bit about that through the legal and ethical lens. The legal lens is copyright and also contractual. I think we're familiar with copyright and the copyright issues and the case law that has been established through HathiTrust and Google cases, the Authors Guild, to establish fair use or establish data analysis as a transformational use and fair use. Contractual issues are come into play with the corpora that we manage because a large part of it, probably 95%, was created through mass digitization partnerships with Google starting over 20 years ago. And the libraries, over 40 or so, who have deposited collections after working with Google, are bound by certain contracts that have various terms of length terms. There's some minor variation in some things, some big variation in others, and there's generally a provision that says, don't redistribute for commercial uses, right? And I think that's an important part that we've been trying to figure out. How do we work within that constraint for a long time? So if we were to work with a commercial entity on a project to answer some of the questions that we posed or to answer some of the questions that Dan was posing, I think we have to think about how would we do so in a way that would be consistent with fair use as we know it today, and does not violate other contractual issues. And I think, to be clear with you, any commercial agent that's ever come to HathiTrust and with an AI in their name and said, hey, we'd love to partner with you, is not there to say, we want to give you some services for money, right? They want access to data that's going to improve a commercial product that they're trying to develop. And I think that's the difficult part of navigation, difficult part of navigating this. And I'd assert that living up to your contractual obligations is an ethical issue, but I think the bigger question here when we think about ethics is AI training to what end and for whom, right? What is it that we want to be able to do with that? And I find this a really challenging question because I don't think I know what all the consequences might be, right? We don't know all the things we might be able to do. We see relatively a lot of comment and gee whiz kinds of applications that come forward, and that sparks some imagination. There's been some more deeper thought of that, of course. But I think, for me, I think a lot about this. I was thinking about Cliff's comment earlier about licensing as the original sin. And I said to Lisa Henschel in the hallway, it's like, what's the original sin that's lurking around right now that we don't recognize, right? And I wonder whether or not it's in this space and what that looks like. And I'm not trying to withhold action based on figuring out the original sin, but it's really a question that we do have to think about a lot here. So I'm thinking about how do we find partners that are working with the public good in mind, and public good not in the sense of a sci-fi fantasy of transforming humanity, but actual public good in the near term, and with a real sense of that. I think we have to think a little bit about our relationship with other ventures that our universities, your universities might be engaging with commercial agents, and how do we avoid working in a way that would result in some sort of proprietary lock-in for products or services or data that might be, you might not be able to take advantage of unless you buy a certain thing. And I think we need to think about what kind of transparency or what transparency would look like about our intention to make the data available or using the data in these ways, and what the outcomes we want to have with them, and what the unintended outcomes might be when those actually occur. So that's where I would start.
Thank you, Mike. Claire, this one is for you. So HathiTrust is huge, but it doesn't have digital copies of everything. So from the perspective of someone leading a very large library, I think University of Illinois has over 15 million volumes, many of which are not yet digitized. What principles do you think should guide library mass digitization in an age of AI?
Thanks, Dave. So I'm going to talk a little bit about principles, but also practices, things I would have on my mind as I was coming to this conversation, which is not entirely imaginary for Illinois, although we, at this point, are not in any active conversation with any commercial entity. But yeah, we're assuming we're talking about general collections. I think there's many more exciting things about our manuscript and special collections, but based on some recent analysis that we've done, we believe we have at least 3 million volumes in Illinois' collection that are not yet represented in HathiTrust. And that's after a decade of us sending things to Google to be digitized. So we've got, I think, 1 million volumes from Illinois' collection showing up in Hathi. We're still sending. We're still digitizing with Internet Archive. We actually have an on-site Internet Archive digitization facility. So, we have a very interesting context. One thing that I would bear in mind, consistent with what both Dan and Mike have said, I wouldn't consider anything that didn't flow back for the greater good. So for me, that means we wouldn't do anything that didn't, of course, flow immediately into HathiTrust or maybe into the corpus that Dave and Dan are going to be building through their project. There has to be something that comes back to this community. I'm always thinking about consistency, so when Google came knocking, we said yes. When Internet Archive came knocking, we said yes. That doesn't mean we have to say yes to everybody. I mean, we've learned a lot since we did that. But I would really want to be mindful of being somewhat consistent in our practice. There are reasons why we said yes to that. This still remains an incredibly expensive activity. I mean, being at it for a decade and having, less than a tenth of our collection actually, less than half of our collection represented in Hathi, with at least 3 million we know aren't there. I would much rather that we were paying for this as a community, but have been around for a long time, and I know why we don't. So I would want to be mindful of that. I would look for as few constraints on my use as possible. Again, to Mike's point, lots of constraints on the content was digitized by Google. Now, that was a very different time. It was before all the legal cases had been settled, so I think there was a reason for that. There was sort of an understanding that we were sharing risk. But I would have a quite different posture on that at this point, partly because, some of those questions have been settled, we believe, but also because we're living with the constraints that have been placed, and we know they're painful, right? They're preventing us from doing things that we would otherwise feel were reasonable things for us to be doing. Something else I would bear in mind is selection. How are we going to go about that? Who's driving? Who gets to decide? Is this going to be careful gap-filling kinds of selection, or is this going to be more Google style, which is they tell us what they don't have yet, and then we provide that to be digitized? I think we'd be looking for some kind of a middle ground there, but again, thinking about if this is truly a mass digitization activity, how are you going to get the benefit of the efficiency of that kind of an approach? And I also always want to think about putting constraints that might create liabilities that we didn't know we were creating when we put the constraints in place. So for me, the classic example is we all used to, maybe a lot of us do, charging fees, publication fees for things that are digitized from our special collections. I think for the most case, what we have in the back of our minds is that we are being reimbursed for all of the time and effort that we put into curating those materials. But the reality is you might be suggesting that you have rights that you don't actually have. So I think being really careful about those kinds of things. And just a final thought, I would go about this with a lot of awareness and humility about our blind spots. I've become aware recently that a lot of our more junior colleagues in the library don't know anything about the Google project. And so they're very, very concerned that when they hear that there's a conversation with some of these big AI companies. So I think the risk of, reputational damage is there. And I just, I have huge blind spots. I was surprised that authors were outraged about their journal content being used for AI training. Like, what did they think we were doing with this? What did they think Google was doing when it was mass digitizing? So I think those would be some of my principles I'd start with.
Thank you. Suzanne, the Bancroft Library, I worked at Berkeley and I fell in love with the Bancroft Library collection. The Bancroft Library holds incredible special collections. Lots of other libraries have awesome special collections too. And a good number are already available digitally. Do these collections raise any special issues when thinking about use for AI training?
Yeah, I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear me say yes, they do. And, it's the thing that makes special collections so valuable for researchers that also kind of make them least useful for machine learning. They're unique. They're often unpublished. They present a very individualized point of view. So, with the uniqueness question, they're not the nice structured data of a book. They're a variety of formats: text, images, scrapbooks, maps, physical items. And they're all often mixed together in a collection that you want to save the context of this was collected by a group or by a person. But it does make it really challenging when you're trying to slice it apart for training AI models. And with the unpublished aspect of that, it's really tricky to figure out the rights. That's a very bespoke process to figure out what rights we have for any specific special collection just for digitizing it. And then you have to add in another layer for then serving it up to an AI tool. And then there's also, again, this is a question that's kind of inherent to AI, but I think it gets magnified when you're looking at special collections, is around amplifying bias. If we're doing all of the papers of Mark Twain, that is a very specific point of view. And if that is huge in your corpus, then that's going to kind of skew the results that you get. So I think that's really a kind of an ethical question to consider when you're using special collections for training AI tools. But the big thing is that even though, yes, Bancroft has amazing special collections, yes, we've been fortunate to digitize a lot of them, it's still tiny. It's a tiny number. And, for AI tools, they really need a huge volume of corpus. So they need a HathiTrust level or, all of the digitized content in our libraries. So special collections are just ultimately too tiny, I think, for being useful in the moment. But, going forward, I think that if we work together through a joint effort of multiple libraries, then we can start to do something more interesting. And of course, with all of the AI tools, the strength of them is on iterating and getting better over time. So if we have a special collection one, then presumably we could start to balance some of these challenges going forward, and there could be something really wonderful. Because right now, what they really provide is a huge opportunity for our researchers to benefit from AI tools, right? We could get much better enhanced metadata for archival processing, the dream of handwritten text analysis, getting OCR for handwritten text is here. It's really possible now. And that ability to then transcribe and provide text for all of our handwritten documents will really increase the digital accessibility of those documents for people who can't make sense of just a static image file, as well as just researchers who want to do text mining, who want to do keyword searching, for students who can't read cursive. Like, there's just so much benefit there. So I'm very excited about that. And then how we harness that and then move it into the next wave of AI training, I think will be really interesting in, wave 2 or wave 3 of the process.
Yeah. All right, Gunter, you're up. I've heard you say before that the University of California accounts for almost 10% of all published research. And the UC system has been a leader in making scholarship available on an open access basis. So does the prospect of big AI companies scooping up massive amounts of UC scholarship for AI training give you any pause? Or has it caused any rethinking about the UC's commitment to open access?
Thank you for this question, Dave. I'm going to take the long way around in answering it, but I promise you I will answer it. So what I think we need to do to answer that question is look at how AI and open access actually intersect and what path forward is in the best self-interest of the academy. And in answering that question, we have to be very clear from the outset. The question in front of us isn't whether published scholarly content will be used for AI training or not. If the content is online, there isn't much an author can do to withhold it from training. It is going to be trained on. The difference is if it's behind a paywall, the publisher will sell it. If it's open access, it's available for training as well. So to my mind, the most important question here is really to consider who benefits from all of this. So let's look at open access first. And I'm going to use a little bit of a holiday-themed definition of open access for all of you here. So to my mind, open access is scholars bestowing on each other as well as on society the great gift of their knowledge so it can be accessed without impediment. Holiday-themed definition. And that, of course, makes open access a system of mutual support among scholars that allows the academy to be more self-sufficient and independent of commercial entities. For instance, it ensures that the academy will not have to buy its own scholarship over and over again in the guise of different tools, in this instance, AI tools. And in that way, open access creates, I think, an unequivocal boon for the academy and the public good. And the beneficiaries of a public good, by definition, are everybody. That does include AI companies who can train on that content. But more importantly, I think for our purposes here, that, and for our own self-interest, that also includes the academy, not-for-profits, government entities, and citizens. And we got to keep our eye on that price. So now contrast that with the subscription model. When an author places their content behind a paywall, then the publisher controls both the access and the copyright. So that makes publishers the sole arbiter of who can utilize that content and how much they need to pay for it. And that's why publishers have been able to strike these lucrative new revenues, these lucrative new deals with AI companies. And that's also why across the country, libraries are now scrambling to prevent publishers from adding clauses to library subscriptions that expressly prohibit computational access or computational analysis. And there's other sessions here at CNI focused on that. So I think the evidence here is very, very clear. The subscription model is not in our best self-interest. Publishers are in control, the publisher benefits, and the academy and the public benefits a whole lot less. So now I'm getting around to answering your question, Dave. That was my long and winded preamble to saying, so in short, UC is not wavering in its commitment to open access, and I really hope that nobody else is either. But what I do think we need to do is seek a dialogue with our authors to help them better understand these very nuanced questions and to help them understand open access in this new AI context so that they don't inadvertently throw out the OA baby with the AI bathwater.
Thank you. So I'm going to throw this open to anyone here. Most of the AI developers are very big tech companies. This is a very capital intensive industry. And many of them are also eager to gain access to collections held by libraries. So the closest analogy I can think of, and this has already come up, is Google approaching libraries about the Google Books project. So I wonder if you have any lessons that you can share, lessons learned from Google Books that might translate to today.
Can I go first? I'll be very short. But yeah, doing a better job of protecting our rights to the data because, as Mike mentioned, those Google contracts were signed institution by institution and had varying degrees of restrictions. And it just makes it much more complicated to do the things that our scholars need and want to do with that content.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to add that or echo that. I want to be clear. Libraries did work really hard and work extensively with Google to negotiate more than what Google originally came to the table with. So let's not forget that. I don't want anybody to throw those folks under the bus because I think they did a heroic job of actually negotiating something that's been beneficial in large ways. What I would say though is that if you're working with a commercial entity now, you want to think, as Claire said, as few limitations as possible for as limited a period of time as you can possibly get. I also would throw in one other thing that I think is often forgotten or maybe not, at least not well remembered, and that is that when Google started scanning with libraries, there was a few years there where that was subjected to intense scrutiny, not just because of contractual or ethical issues, but because of the quality of what was coming out. And I think that got a lot of heat on libraries and on Google. And libraries were working really hard with Google at that time, too, to really focus on quality. And I was thinking about this afternoon, that the use case that an AI company might come to the library with is going to be different than some of the use cases that the library might have, and be thinking about, when you talk about ensuring that you have good quality data, what are the things that you mean quality for? Or I guess quality is contextual for particular purposes. So,
yeah, I think one of the opportunities we have that is given to us by using this hindsight on Google is we have an opportunity to really have a conversation now about our values that we want to see instantiated in agreements like that and what principles we are espousing. And folks have already hit on some of those. And I think that means if we want to have those conversations, ideally we would resist non-disclosure agreements so we can talk frankly with one another. But even if we're under non-disclosure agreements, I think this idea of talking about values and principles still holds. Those are abstract enough that I think we can have those conversations. And I think one of the key ones that I would highlight there, and I'm just using different words than what Suzanne used, is we should not agree to any enclosure of the commons. None of us should sign agreements that contractually curtail in any way, shape, or form the public domain. And that feels very fundamental to me in all of this and something we can all espouse to.
So I struggle to find any research university that doesn't have some sort of new AI research center or initiative. For those of you who were in here before, Yale did an incredible presentation, and I think the headline number I read was 150 million that they've pushed into AI. So academic users are eager to gain access to collections too, for text data mining, computational research applications, AI uses. Should we be thinking about meeting those research needs differently than how we approach commercial AI users?
Maybe I'll start here. So I think here the history of digital scholarship, digital humanities, text and data mining applications in academia provide a nice sort of history of how in the academy we've used these technologies for I think different reasons. And again, I go back to the just sort of general models and what they're being used for now versus what might happen within the university. So I think absolutely within a university, you could imagine more narrow cast or niche applications of AI or small language models that would, I think, emerge. There's all kinds of research-oriented and learning-oriented applications that I think are just sort of outside of the big mass of what, OpenAI is trying to do. And again, I think we've already started to see some of that in some of the sessions at CNI. So I think, we should find ways, and this relates to the last question, to have a kind of quid pro quo where we get what we really want out of these AI models. I think this question of sort of balance of power and thinking about our values, what we want to maintain, what we want to get out of it, it's a chance to kind of have a redo on the Google Books thing where the quid pro quo was, hey, we're Google, we've got a founder who's always had this vision of scanning libraries and is willing to spend $1 billion on it. And so there was a lot of excitement about that. And there was, I looked back in my notes of Cliff Lynch gave a talk literally 20 years ago that I was at. And my notes from that was saying, like, if we don't take this Google offer, there's no other, we're not going to be able to scan 30 million books ourselves. It would just cost too much. We'd be worried about all these other things. And so the balance of power 20 years ago is sort of different now. And so I think getting just a clear sense of what we want out of AI, which differs from what, an OpenAI, which as all the reports have shown, they're kind of running out of high quality content. And all of these companies are desperate for book-like gold standard, high quality content to improve their models. And so I think we have actually more leverage than last time in trying to come to some deal that respects our values and provides the opportunities for, again, more academic and research and learning applications than we had last time.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think actually, it behooves us to make sure that we are continuing to explore uses of this technology in such a way that we can defend those fair use rights and the other usage rights that we suffered a lot to establish those major lawsuits, a huge amount of money, a lot of risk for our institutions. So I personally would love to see us, ensure, and I'm very excited about the project that Dan and Dave are leading, because I think it helps us think about how to overcome some of the technology barriers for our own scholarly communities, and I feel far more comfortable doing things within the academy than I do, crossing over into using as many assurances as they may give us about, we're going to keep your data safe. Things do happen. I would much rather see a lot of really robust investigations, experimentation happening within the academy. I'm also thinking a lot about what I would say is it's really hard to align research agendas, right? So computer scientists and digital humanists have struggled with this for a very long time. But I think there's a lot to be gained here from whether it's computer scientists or high performance computing, very rich set of data to potentially do really interesting work that benefits society in some really direct and powerful ways. So I think it's important for us to be thinking about, how do we get out there? How do we establish those relationships and those conversations? If anyone wants to talk about their high performance computing group, come find me after, because I'm really interested in trying to bring our communities together.
I have one other thing that's kind of under-formulated, but I wanted to throw it in anyway, because why not? The part of what your question makes me think about is that when we think about making it available for researchers versus commercial entities, we have different relationships to those, and we get different things from working with those communities, right? It's obviously our mission to serve the researchers. Researchers research, they create things that aren't necessarily applicable or translatable, or it can move easily into scalable production environments. But that's what we are imagining, I think, a lot of times when we think about making use of AI, emerging technologies in this space, and commercial companies are really good at that. And so I think there's a little bit of a challenge here for us to think about what is this we want as end result, and not just as process. And then how's the right way to structure a relationship so you get that? I've struggled a lot over the years with application in this space. So.
Just kind of back to the previous question. I mean, Google has done amazing things to correct curvature in books and, reprocess OCR over time. I would love to know how they're doing, have access to all that metadata technology. Mm-hmm. I don't know that it's possible to explore those things on the front end, but to the extent that there is benefit like that could come back to us. My colleagues have been very thoughtful about talking about should we have firewalls between the work that we do in libraries and, research that's going on elsewhere. I think that's wise to really watch the boundaries there.
Sure.
All right, so this is a pretty open-ended one. What are the biggest risks you see in libraries making their collections available for AI training?
There's friendships were lost over the Google Books project. So, and I think if anything, it's a more fraught environment with some of these companies, and in some cases for a very good reason. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the biggest risks is the risk for some reputational damage.
There are obvious ethical issues that remain pretty vital around the application of AI, especially on top of special collections and other archival materials, misidentifications, various forms of unethical uses that might leak out. So, in the project that Dave and I are working on, we are having AI ethicists and others participate in that because we would like to forecast a bit more, and we'd love to hear from the audience about ways of at least minimizing those kinds of risks.
I think it's also worth remembering that library collections are full about data research, right? And the way that I think the question of how that gets consumed and used in these models is important as well. And if it's about a statistically predicting order of words, that's one thing, right? But if it gets into inferences based on that order of words, I think that's a different set of questions. So,
yeah, it really does bring up that amplifying the biases that exist in much older research. Yeah,
I think libraries might also have some very direct exposure already to some risk here, in the sense that libraries themselves are also publishers and we're also managers of repositories, right? And those repositories and those publications are likely already being utilized to train AI. And I think that then comes back to these questions about that our authors might have about how much openness do they feel they can tolerate, and how much are their reactions to all of that going to be driven by their varying visions of where AI may lead us. And some of our authors have very dystopian visions of where AI may lead us. So we as libraries will also have to have good answers, I think, when it comes to the content we ourselves are already making openly available. And again, have a strong dialogue with our authors around why it's made openly available and why there are important principles there that we need to uphold.
I'll add my own risk. I think, related to that, when we saw some of these major licensing deals announced between some of the bigger academic publishers and the AI companies, there was pretty widespread outrage among academic authors. And, I think part of it was due to, certainly some of it was just like an objection to AI generally. But I think a lot of it was this reaction of like, we've seen this movie before, and we didn't like it the first time when our rights were just kind of handed over, or we felt compelled to hand them over, and then we to gain access to our own works, we had to buy them back at incredible prices, and just a real discomfort with that. And so I think libraries could get into trouble really, really quickly if it is perceived that they are kind of auctioning off collections to the highest bidder.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so how about something more positive? What do you see as the benefit?
Well, I touched on a little bit of just working with the AI tools themselves is obviously a huge benefit, especially, like I said, for some of our special collections that are kind of trapped right now in either archives or in the formats that they're in. So, and then Dan, I think your project really brings up the potential for our faculty researchers to really experiment with developing new tools that are perhaps have a higher value and a higher trust rate. So I think that's where there's a lot of potential there.
Go ahead, click.
Well, just that we still have a huge amount of content that is not visible in any way to any of these tools, and it'll take us hundreds of millions of dollars, most likely, to get that content digitized. So there's sort of a very kind of direct financial benefit. But the one that I think drives me the most is to be an active player in defending those rights that I was talking about earlier, that were so difficult for us to establish. If we are not the active agents in this conversation, in this space, and we're leaving it up to the AI companies to defend the computational uses of this content, I think that puts us at a disadvantage. I'm very worried about what might happen to those hard-won rights.
I'm going to be very self-serving here, and this will be the world premiere of the reading out of an op-ed that Dave and I wrote that should be coming out imminently in Inside Higher Ed, because we put some language to this that I think is helpful and compelling. So here's the world premiere. Even if an AI future sounds dystopian, it feels intuitive that ethical and beneficial uses of AI are more likely to emerge with engagement from the academy rather than by ceding the field to commercial interests. Would you rather have an AI based on peer-reviewed literature or Reddit, YouTube, and 4chan? AI will be a more powerful tool for the academy and more likely to benefit society if it can be trained on the most trustworthy and reliable sources of writing, including peer-reviewed scholarly literature. And I think that really is just a summation of a lot of what you all have said on the panel as well.
Well articulated.
Yeah.
And I'll just add, and this I think reflects what Suzanne was saying before. I'll put my history professor hat on. There's so many collections that are sort of opaque to researchers. Yeah. We can't search through them, whether they're handwritten and thus are not fully transcribed, or just to add in all the amazing things that the transformer technology behind a lot of this modern AI can do. I don't speak every language, but now I sort of can if I want to search through the index of a book of a language that I can't speak. Putting my librarian hat back on, I have learners come into the library who learn better through audio means. They'd rather have an audio book than a text in front of them. We have the ability to serve our patrons in a way that can transform from one media type to another media type. I could go on, but if you just think about any kind of transformation from one type to another, or any of the type of computer vision or analysis things, it just makes our overall collections, I think, much more useful, much more transparent. And that is just it's a real net positive. And so I think there's a lot still to be done. I still think we're like in the first inning or whatever sports metaphor you want to do. But I think having librarians and IT professionals in the university help to marshal in the sort of more community-based uses rather than, again, the kind of big general models, I think will show us in the coming years what the real advantages are of AI when they're applied across the full surface of the library collection.
All right. Now you get to ask some questions. So we are going to open it up, and I'm going to try to see. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. I really like library need to be active agent in this game. I heard you guys talk about both sides of a coin, benefits and risks. I just wonder about whether you have further insights about, instead of talking about the whole library collections, whether there is subset of collections you figure out, either Dave for your project or for other libraries, we might be able to consider as a first type of a pilot. We can at least establish relationship with AI company, start exploring the AI advancement to enhance discoverability with a nice risks.
I think, to my mind, one of the potential low-hanging fruits in terms of risk is the public domain book collection, because that makes for a very, very clean project in the sense that if an AI company agrees that they won't put restrictions around their content, you can tell the world that you have digitized that material with the help of somebody else and made it available to the world. And then it also so happens that AI companies can now train on it, but the public benefit is really clear and can be clearly foregrounded. It also helps that when we talk about public domain materials, those authors, by and large, are no longer alive. And so it helps.
Public domain is very long.
It helps in the sense that there's not going to be active umbrage from authors who feel like somehow their content has been treated in ways that they don't appreciate.
Yeah, and there was also some very thoughtful conversation, and I think it was in the Yale session about responsible workflows and some of the very problematic content that we have in some of our collections. So I think all of that has to be taken into account. To as much as I would like to see just mass digitization, I think there's some good things to be mindful of and aware of there. And that might be public domain material, actually.
All right, I'm going to go over here. Rachel.
Hi. So my question actually follows up on what you were saying, Gunter, about engagement and also labor. What we heard from Yale, how they have some faculty and university buy-in for the overall AI endeavor, but what does it actually look like for a library to work with faculty to bring them on board, so that you don't have the situation of when they're still alive having to respond to negativity? Because as you all well know, we're 25 years into open access, and still every day we get questions about, why is my thing open? I don't want to make it open. So that also leads into an issue of labor. Who within the library is doing that outreach and engagement?
Thank you, Rachel. I have a first UC-centric answer to that question, which is, I think within UC, our best tool here is to work through the academic senate, who represents our faculty and our authors, and to ensure that they understand what we're trying to achieve, to get them on the record on that. And I think they have a good track record at this point of being willing to go on the record on those kinds of issues and make statements. And then we have something we can stand on when authors come and say, like, well, I didn't appreciate what you did here, because we can point to the best thing we have, which is a university consensus through a representative body, and not to keep it in the just UC-centric space. I think that's probably an opportunity many of us have to just work through our governance structures to make sure that this is properly understood, and that they're the appropriate public statements that then can be pointed to. And I think in terms of who does the labor, in some ways that touches all of us, I think. In a lot of ways, there's so many moving parts to this that we have, I think, a lot of folks who will need to get engaged. Sorry, that's very hand-wavy and wishy-washy, but I really have a hard time drawing a very, very bright line here.
And I don't, this wasn't what you were going at specifically, Rachel, but when we started the conversation in Illinois about what if a very large and wealthy technology company was willing to write very large checks to have your collection digitized, we thought quite broadly about what our costs were. I mean, with Google, University of Illinois created new staff positions and funded the work to actually pull everything off of the shelf. To Mike's point, we're in a different world now. The balance of power or the motivations are quite different. So I think I personally would think quite broadly about what's the labor involved here, and if there was a company that was willing to pay. Now, I think you also have to be careful about that for obvious reasons, but one way to think about it.
Hi. Hey, all. Stu Schneidman from Harvard. Compelling topic, great panel. Thanks for your insights. Okay, Dave, Dan, I'll bite. Can you tell us a little bit more about your upcoming initiatives?
Yeah, so I mean, this project grew out of, as Dan said, kind of an observation about what's happening right now with AI training on books, and it's like kind of scattershot. They've to the extent that they have trained on books, it's mostly relied on things like the Books 3 database, which is 183,000 or so books that aren't really representative of anything that you would think is kind of what you'd find in research libraries. So just, I guess I'll give you some operational kind of outline of what the project will look like. The plan is to basically sprint over the next year to develop a startup plan for how to develop a entity, either a new entity, an existing entity, that can take on the work of actually assembling and stewarding a public interest corpus of books that really prioritizes academic research, public interest first. So what that'll look like over the next year or so is a bunch of meetings. It's a lot of just talking with people, and not just in the library community either. I think we're trying to cast a pretty wide net. We want to talk with some of these people from technology companies. We want to talk with a lot of the academic text and data mining researchers and the people who are using these things on campus already to understand what kind of needs do they have that maybe aren't even being met yet. So right now we are pulling together an advisory board, and we have a couple of positions that we're hiring to help us move this along. And I think you'll see something publicly from us about opportunities for engagement, probably in the late spring or so. Do you have anything you want to add, Dan?
That's good.
I can't see. Oh, here, go ahead.
Hi, Bruce Hedrick with JSTOR. One of the risks that I didn't hear anyone speak about, maybe it's implied, but is scale and speed. Like what's happening now, it seems to me one of the greatest risks is what's happening now is happening so fast and with so much investment that the collective ecosystem we're sitting in ourselves in higher education, will it be able to respond to answer some of the questions, Claire, that you've put forward, or Suzanne, fast enough to be able to actually match what's happening outside of our ecosystem? And the level of investment required there seems pretty substantial. So I was wondering if you all might speak to that. The second point I wanted to ask, which is maybe more provocative, is have you all thought about if and when these actual questions to be answered move out of your realm and move to the enterprise, where the institution decides they need to take this deal because we have budget considerations that need to be thought about, and the question actually is removed from your purview altogether?
So simple. I mean, to your first question, yeah, right, absolutely. I do worry about that. I don't know. I mean, there's no way for us to do this work on our own without engaging outside, right? And yet, what is the stable? There's no stable ground, right? To even know what we're going to be looking for or working with in a year or so. I mean, I think one question I wonder about is like if anybody has been making approaches to libraries about digitization, like over the course of 6 weeks, how does their calculus change based on whatever they're doing and their modeling outside? So I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's true. I think to your last point, I tried to gesture towards that earlier on, that if we ever find ourselves working with a commercial entity, I am a little bit concerned about how that entity is chosen and what other pressures are brought to bear in those conversations. And, because we have depositors who may have their own pressures to bring to bear to that. I think that's quite a possibility. This will actually maybe a little bit more provocative and maybe put me out on a limb, but I would say it'd be really useful to know when when universities sign contracts with some of these companies, are they financially invested in those companies as well through their endowments? Maybe not have anything, right hand, left hand, but there's still an important disclosure there. So
I'll just add on your first point about the risk. It's absolutely the case. And all the things that we're talking about, the principles that make so much sense and are wanting to do things ethically and making sure that we're signing contracts that we feel good about in the future takes time. And these companies move really fast. And so the same way that Dan wrote 20 years ago about, like, if we miss this boat with Google, no one else is coming along. Like it feels like you've got like a very short amount of time to jump on board, and then otherwise the ship is on. So that I think is a real risk. Yeah.
Yeah, and on the second one, I think it actually presents an interesting opening, depending on the relationships each of us have with our senior university administration, to get there first, to open the conversation. I mean, even though Illinois has been a Google partner and has been doing IA scanning, these jobs turn over so quickly at this point that there was almost no institutional knowledge at the top of my university about book digitization. So I took that as an opportunity to talk to my council and to talk to my provost and explain, what the pros and cons were and what the risks were and why we were even considering this. But that won't work everywhere. So I think it's a really good point. Yeah.
I would just add the risk also goes the other direction, right? You might very well feel like you're in a good position to strike a deal, and a deal that you can be proud of, and your administration may say, we are not comfortable with this because the reputational risk for getting involved with companies who are on an almost daily basis in the headlines for something or something else is too great, and we don't know where this all will be headed and what kind of headlines are coming. So I think there's a lot here at play. I would also say the dynamic is really super interesting to me in the sense that there's so much pressure to move fast here because this entire environment feels like a tornado. And I really wonder how much we should just take a step back and really just let the due diligence here be at work, have a collective conversation about all of this and not rush into this, and whether that truly forecloses our opportunity. The AI companies are telling us, you do it now or we'll never do it. I don't believe it. So I think, let's not overestimate what we can do in the next 5 minutes, and let's not underestimate what we can achieve if we take a little more time. Maybe we need to find the right balance there.
The clock says we are -2 minutes. So thank you all for holding on. Can we give a round of applause for the panelists? Thank you so much.